Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer.
You shouldn't underestimate the exhilaration he must have felt as a young man finding his way in the world by this opportunity to be involved in a meaningful way in the creation of a new nation in the Southern Hemisphere.
Can you imagine Australia without government bureaucrats? Well, for Robert Garran, Australia's first ever Commonwealth public servant, that was the situation he faced at Federation in 1901. Joining me to discuss Garran is former diplomat Colin Milner. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Colin.
Thank you, Georgina.
It's probably a little bit of a dramatic introduction, but he was technically the first Commonwealth public servant, wasn't he? Although we would have had many public servants from the colonial regimes and, of course,
yes,
Britain.
You're right to make that point. I mean, it wasn't a claim, so far as I can tell, that he ever actually made himself. And he was careful in his memoir to acknowledge what you're alluding to, which was that the customs officials from the various colonies became the customs service of the new Commonwealth on the 1st of January 1901. But I suspect he was the only Commonwealth public servant who actually did some real work on that day. And he refers to that in his memoir when he talks about typing up the first issue of the Commonwealth Gazette and taking it to the printer.
I mean, this is really early days we're talking about. But before we get on to this discussion, who is Robert Garran? For people who aren't familiar with him, and they should be, and they will be after listening to this podcast, residents of the ACT may be familiar with the suburb, Garran, of course.
Yes. He's probably better known here, I suspect, than anywhere else.
And yes, I should say we're recording in Canberra at the ANU, which is fantastic, where you're doing your PhD on Garran. So tell me who he was.
Well, Garran was born in Sydney. His parents were well connected. His father was editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, and his mother was quite prominent, particularly in charitable work in Sydney. He became involved with the federal movement in the 1890s as a young barrister. He'd gone to Sydney Grammar and studied classics at the University of Sydney and then got admitted to the bar beforehand. And in the course of the federal movement, he became the expert really on the federal constitution, from a legal point of view especially. And he served as secretary to the drafting committee at the final convention in 1897-98. And he was asked by Alfred Deakin to become the first secretary of the Attorney General's Department, served in that capacity from 1901 until he retired in 1932 at the age of 65. And no other Commonwealth government permanent head has served as long. And then he continued in a very active retirement virtually until his death.
And he lived till 90, so we're talking about a great span of a career. And I should add, too, he was appointed the first Attorney General and first Commonwealth public servant, wasn't he, at the age of something like 30?
Yes, he was actually 30. He turned 33 when he became secretary, that's right, but he was very young.
Yes.
And that was a reflection of the reputation he'd already gained and the impression he'd made on some of the early leaders like Barton and Deakin.
It's interesting with the Mandarins. They're incredibly important figures in Australian history. And, of course, we talk about the Seven Dwarfs, Nugget Coombs and Crawford and others. But they're not prominent figures in the writing of the story of our nation, are they? So is that what has inspired your study into Garran?
Yes. In basic terms, yes. I think it's natural when people are examining Australian history in the first instance to focus on the politicians because, in terms of the history of the Commonwealth, because of the power and influence that they exert. But I think you can get a more holistic picture of what's going on if you examine the senior bureaucrats as well. Now, that's been done now much more recently in relation to the post-war Reconstruction generation, and you've alluded to Coombs and Crawford, and there are also, biographies of Shedden and Arthur Tang and so on. And I think that has helped our understanding of that period. But there's been much less done on the earlier period. And as far as I'm concerned, Garran is the most significant of the early Commonwealth public servants. And I think it's timely for someone to attempt a more comprehensive understanding of his life and career than has been yet attempted.
Now, Garran has an interesting family background, doesn't he? And I mean, we're recording this on the day when the US presidential election results
Indeed.
are being released. Of course, from Australia's perspective, the election was yesterday, but from America's perspective, because of the time difference, it was today. He does have some interesting family connections.
That's right. Well, as you know, his middle name is Randolph. He's Robert Randolph Garran, and I tend to emphasise it in how I write things up. And that alludes to the fact that his great-grandparents were loyalists. They were American colonists who were loyalists of the American Revolution. And his great-grandmother in particular was Elizabeth Randolph of Virginia. And she was a younger first cousin of Thomas Jefferson, third president of the United States, author of the Declaration of Independence. And his mother was a Randolph. And so even from childhood, I suspect, assuming that like most children, Garran would have been curious about the origins of his middle name. I think he was probably aware of this family connection, and it grew and developed over time to inspire him in large part, I think, to get involved in the federal movement, because he could see the connections with the similar period in the formation of the United States.
Yeah, so in terms of his involvement in the federal movement, is there much evidence that he's looking at the American Constitution and the way Americans have developed their own federation and I guess the separation of powers between the states and the Commonwealth and the like, and the three branches of government? Was he, and our Senate, of course, different from the House of Lords, it's elected.
Yes.
Were these very strong influences on him from that American connection?
Yes, I would say so. He produces 2 books in the period of the federal movement and shortly afterwards. One is The Coming Commonwealth, which is really a handbook for federalists, and he goes into the history of federalism and the contemporary examples of federalism, preeminently the United States, but also Canada, Switzerland, and the then German Empire. And this helps to establish his reputation. He writes in his diary the first time he meets Alfred Deakin, and Deakin bounds up to him and at the Adelaide Convention and says, "I've been reading your book. It's wonderful," So it has some influence. And then, of course, with John Quick, he produces the famous Quick and Garran, published in 1901, which is really a classic of constitutional law and history. And it's very evident in that, both in the historical introduction, which Garran, in fact, claims to have written himself, and in the annotations to the Constitution text, which is the bulk of the document. It's very evident that he and Quick had a profound knowledge of the American Constitution and how it had developed.
The Federation movement starts off in earnest in the 1880s, but it sort of stalls, doesn't it, by 1891. And Garran does a lot to sort of give it some grassroots popular support, doesn't he?
He does, yes,
Yeah.
yes. I mean,
Was that maybe him flirting with politics, do you think, or did he never see himself as having that role?
Well, he can be called an activist, a political activist in the 1890s, and I think that gives him an understanding of politics and politicians, which serves him well when he becomes a public servant. But I think he kind of works out that being a bureaucrat may actually suit his talents and his temperament. And I think he likes, in the positions that he occupies after Federation, he likes being close to the centre of the action continuously, regardless of political changes of government. So, there are both aspects. I think it's interesting what happens in the 1890s. He's there at the start. He's in the Legislative Council chamber in Sydney when the initial Constitutional Convention is held in 1891, led by Sir Henry Parkes. But that sort of top-down approach that Parkes attempted does stall. And by 1893, it's pretty clear that a different approach is required. And that's where Edmund Barton sets up the Australasian Federation League in New South Wales. And, of course, one mustn't forget what happens in the other colonies. But New South Wales, I think, is crucial as to whether Federation will go ahead or not. And it's a bit uncertain through the 1890s whether New South Wales will come on board. So that league plays an important part. Garran is elected to a leadership role in that league. He's only 26, if that. And he plays an important role in the Corowa, the unofficial Federation conference at Corowa later in 1893. That's curious because none of the big leaders, like Barton or Deakin, attend that conference. And it's probably gained more importance looking back in retrospect than was apparent at the time. But the famous Corora Plan was decided there, and Garran was involved in those discussions. Quick put it forward at the conference, and basically the idea was that there should be an elected convention to draft a text of the Constitution, which would then be put to the people of the colonies by referendum. And that's, in fact, the process which eventually led to federation.
And you think that proposal and then the implementation of that proposal gave more popular support to the push for federation, because there was that, we're going to choose people to attend these conventions who are of you, who are representing you, not just handpicked by, politicians.
Yes. Oh, I think that elected process for the convention and then the referendum was significant in terms of encouraging popular support for the process. Garran's very enthusiastic about the popular movement, as he calls it. I suspect it was not quite as popular as he liked to think it was, but it's understandable because he was so closely involved with it all. But certainly compared to the earlier process that Parkes tried, it was more popular and ultimately was part of the successful outcome.
I recall recording a podcast on the Federation movement with William Coleman. I mean, he certainly was making a case that, there was a bit of disengagement and very low voter turnout, and, it really wasn't considered sort of great moment or great sort of series of moments in Australian history in terms of captivating the hearts and mind of the nation as we perhaps give it in the retelling.
Yes, well, I'm aware of William's very interesting book on the subject, and it has certainly encouraged me to go back and think through particularly Garran's motivations. And William emphasises that lawyers and bureaucrats were the ones who stood to gain most from the Federation, and Garran was both.
Yes, suited him on both counts.
Yeah, and it's undoubtedly true that Garran was an able and ambitious young man who was alert to opportunities for professional advancement and saw Federation as a possibility for that. But I think there's more. I think human motives are often mixed, and I think there was an idealistic streak to Garran in relation to federalism and federation, which, it combined a whole range of parts in him. One was the ambitious young man. One was the family connections. One was, including the fact that his father was a prominent federalist from an early time, so he grew up with it. And there was a kind of an emotional, legal, constitutional aspect to it all, which enthused him. I mean, I think he was, you shouldn't underestimate the exhilaration he must have felt as a young man finding his way in the world by this opportunity to be involved in a meaningful way in the creation of a new nation in the Southern Hemisphere.
And because he was so young, and of course he writes with John Quick, the annotated constitution of the Australian Commonwealth, in 1901, and he lives till 1950, I think it is 57, right? Mm-hmm. So he, for 56 years, is the author of this book and can talk about this book, and he was there at the conventions. He basically outlives, because he was so young at the time, he outlives everyone else. So does he become, even though he's not a High Court judge, does he become the sort of key authority in Australia on the Constitution, and people defer to him? Was there a sort of sense of great power? Not to suggest that he misused that, but he would have been given.
Well, he certainly was listened to with great respect on the constitutional issues till the end of his life. And I think there was a sense, because he was the last real survivor of the federal movement in terms of being at the centre of things, there was a sense in which he's seen as a figure of almost mythic significance, And I mean, I take William Coleman's point about the diversity of views about federation, that we shouldn't get too caught up in the myth-making. But I understand, in a sense, where Garran is coming from. He felt proud of the achievement in 1901. He, I think, quite reasonably said, not many people want to go back to what was before. And he had a kind of almost proprietorial interest in its well-being.
He's been described as an independent Australian Briton. I mean, this is at a time when Australians were British subjects, and of course the whole Section 44 issue would have played out very differently back then. We should perhaps later look up his analysis of Section 44. But he's an Australian, born in Australia, and he's proud of his Australian identity, but he sees that through the British Empire, of course, and Australia as a dominion. Do you think that it's always hard with 2024 vision to imagine how people viewed their sense of identity 123 years ago? But for him, was federation an incredibly important step to part company from Britain, or would it not have been seen in that view?
I think he was comfortable with being both an Australian nationalist and a British imperialist. What I think is significant about federation for people like Garran and some of the people he was working with is that achievement of nationhood would lift the status of Australia and Australians in the empire. It's interesting, his friend Attlee Hunt, who's involved with him in the movement with Barton as a young man, and then is another person who becomes a permanent head in 1901. He writes to Garran from the 1907 Colonial Conference in London, because he knows Garran will be interested. And he is appalled by the behaviour towards him. He's gone with Deakin to the conference, Deakin being Prime Minister by then. He's appalled by the behaviour of the British Colonial Office towards him as an official from the colonies, And they hate being regarded as colonists. They've got a great sense and a great desire to be recognised as a nation. I think it's also bound up with overcoming the sense of the taint of convictism in Australia's historical past. And these people, this is high Victorianism carried over. They have a great sense of their personal, their family, and their social respectability. Mm-hmm. And respectability is an idea which, had more currency then than it really has now. But I think it's all bound up with this sense of wanting to be recognised as having a dignified status. But it allows them then to feel as though they can make a contribution to the empire more broadly. That's important, particularly in those early decades after Federation. By the end of his life, Garran accepts that the dominions have become independent. He's got an ability to see how things evolve and understand how things have evolved and accept how they've evolved. And indeed goes so far in his memoir as to welcome the fact that India could remain a member of the Commonwealth of Nations after it becomes a republic in 1950. He welcomes the prospect of, black African nations joining the Commonwealth, the broader Commonwealth of Nations, which Garner does in 1957, the year of his death. So he's developing with the times. Now, back in the 90s, he's guilty of quite racially offensive language.
Yeah, this, of course, we should note. So he becomes the first Secretary of the Attorney General's Department, and he is instrumental, isn't he, in drafting the Immigration Restriction Act, which we otherwise know as the White Australia policy.
Yes, well, it was seen as a foundation principle for the new Commonwealth of Australia. Yes, I think Garran's view did emphasise, this idea of whiteness in those decades. It's interesting to see how he develops, in various ways. By the 1930s, he's recognising that Australia needs to develop relationships with Asia. He's very happy about the fact that his friend Latham, as Minister for External Affairs, makes a diplomatic visit to the Far East, or the New North, as we should perhaps call it, in 1934. He welcomes broader European immigration after the Second World War in Australia. How he would have felt about Asian immigration, it's not really clear, I don't think. But similarly, his views about Indigenous Australians and their contribution to the nation were fairly conventional for white Australians at the time. I think in 1901 he probably saw Indigenous Australians as a dying race, as so many did. But of course they weren't. Mm. And it's curious because he goes, in his diary, he writes quite enthusiastically about going to a lecture given by the anthropologist Baldwin Spencer in Melbourne in 1902. And Spencer has done a lot of research into Aboriginal culture in Northern Australia. He's quite enthusiastic about this lecture by Baldwin Spencer about what he's discovered about Aboriginal culture in Northern Australia. And really, the curious thing is it has no impact, it seems, on his perceptions of the role that Indigenous Australians might play in the modern Australian Commonwealth.
Right, yeah. His, I guess, struggle with how Australia should be respected and, I guess, consulted in Dominion matters, particularly with Britain and British officials, comes to the fore, of course, in World War One. And the Prime Minister at the time, Billy Hughes, and, there's obviously massive debates in World War One around censorship, conscription, all of which Garran, of course, as a key public servant, is heavily involved in. I think there's a wonderful quote, isn't there, that you have from Hughes: the best way to govern Australia was to have Sir Robert Garran at his elbow with a fountain pen and a blank sheet of paper and the War Precautions Act.
Yes, well, the War Precautions Act was a fairly draconian piece of legislation. It's considered even to have been stronger than the Defence of the Realm Act in the UK, which was passed at about the same time and on which the War Precautions Act was modelled. And Garran gets very caught up in its administration. He has a lot of the powers of the Attorney General, who is still Hughes at that stage, even though Hughes is also Prime Minister, delegated to him as the first Solicitor General in 1916. And he's caught up with what I would argue was excessive administration of the War Precautions Act. Now, there's always a tension in war between the needs of national security and individual liberties, but I think the considered view of historians, which I would agree with, is that they went too far. One case he was involved with, which was actually, it extended even after the end of the First World War. One case he was involved with was the case of a Catholic priest named Father Jurga, who had basically grown up in Australia but was in fact German-born and remained an alien. He was deported in 1920 eventually. Garran's involved in the final consideration of his case. And, Gerard Henderson, in an article in 1976, really is very critical of Garran's handling of that case and makes some very cogent points. But I think Garran was part of the political elite which was very concerned to, as they saw it, protect the Australian community from perceived threats, whether it was, German militarism, communism, anarchism, whatever it was, all the isms really. And, that's evident in how he goes about administering it. He could be sometimes less. There is one case I'm aware of, the case of Max Hurst, who was an orthopaedic surgeon, where he isn't as unbending as some of his bureaucratic colleagues, and he's allowed to remain in Australia.
So at this time, during the World War One, of course, Robert Menzies is a university student at the University of Melbourne. Wouldn't have known Garran particularly. He might have heard of him, but he certainly would have heard of Billy Hughes, that's for sure. And Menzies writes this prize-winning essay, which we have in the Menzies collection. He was obviously very proud of it, and he should be. It's called The Rule of Law During the War, and it wins the Bowen Prize. And it really is in response to the War Precautions Act and its overreach. So this sort of idea that liberties will be deprived by executive decree without recourse to Parliament. And, of course, there are considerations of national security that the governments must take into account. But, what is the price of security? How much freedom does one give up? And how much freedom do you give up without recourse back to the elected representatives of your nation, but just give it to a government that, at least into an election, can, through acts like this, get away with quite a lot?
Yes, well, I'm aware of Menzies' essay. There's also a copy in the National Library. The way in which he writes about the War Precautions Act is favourable, I think, to the kind of views that Garran would have had. Garran himself defends his actions, and in articles written after the war, and then finally in his memoir at some length, he puts his faith in the fact that, behind him, in a chain of responsibility, really, behind him as secretary, there was the Attorney General. The Attorney General, of course, is, responsible to the Parliament, and the Parliament is ultimately responsible to the electorate. I mean, technically that is all true, but it perhaps doesn't just allow for the realities of the situation.
No.
I think there is a case to be made that there should have been a more selective approach. And what it actually reveals is the capacity in a liberal democracy for legal and administrative coercion to be taken too far. And, I think it's still a live subject of debate when you consider issues like robo-debt and the response on the pandemic and so on. Different circumstances, of course, but
it's a deprivation of liberty without.
Yeah, I mean, I think care is required in how you go about doing anything like that, and that's what I would argue was perhaps an element which was lacking a bit lacking quite a bit actually in the First World War.
So I'm interested to hear what Garran's role was at the Paris Peace Conference in 1918. I mean, these were moments when Australia really did play a pivotal role, despite Britain perhaps trying to marginalise Australia's voice in these conferences, and of course at Versailles as well.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, the background, of course, is that the Australian government wasn't consulted on the terms of peace that were largely agreed at the armistice in 1918. And this broke a promise that the British government had given earlier. And Hughes went wild. Garran and his colleagues who were with Hughes in London, Latham and Frederick Eggleston, for example, were also quite incensed. And it's an interesting story to look at all of that, as I've done. Lloyd George is the Prime Minister. He's caught a bit out by the fast-moving events. And indeed, the German government under Prince Max as the last of the Kaiser's chancellors, he's brought in to sue for peace. He'd previously been head of the German Red Cross. They go to America because America is now in the war. President Wilson has made his famous 14-point speech, and they like the look of that better than what they think Britain or France might do to them. And so they go to America. So Lloyd George is even a bit out of it, as the British Prime Minister. So it's an interesting scenario. To his credit, though, Lloyd George, aware of the dismay that this has all caused, does go to the Allies, the other Allies, and advocates successfully for the Dominions to have representation at the Paris Peace Conference and ultimately to sign the Treaty of Versailles in their own right. Now, they're still part of the British Empire delegation at the Paris Peace Conference, but nevertheless, they are recognised as nations. And I think that goes some way to assuaging the upset that people like Garran felt about what had happened at the time of the armistice.
Do you think this was a pivotal moment for the development of Australia's autonomy from Britain? How Garran and Hughes and others handled Australia's place and position at these conferences?
Well, I think so. I think the experience of the First World War brought home to people like Hughes and Garran the sense that Australia's national interests weren't necessarily the same as British interests. Mm. And there could be conflicts, particularly in relation to the Pacific. There was at that stage a concern about rising Japan and so on in the Pacific and on the part of the Australian government. So I think they did perceive this strongly by the end of the war. And so it meant that any notion, for example, of imperial federation, which, had been discussed intermittently in groups like the Round Table, which Garran was a member of, in fact, that subsided, particularly as far as Australia was concerned. And by the end of the First World War, I think they're committed to a path that will ultimately lead to Dominion independence.
Garran's obviously retired from public service by the time Queen Elizabeth II visits Australia for the first time in 1954, which I know some commentators have said is the apogee of popular monarchism in Australia. I mean, there's some incredible figure like 75% of the population actually physically saw the Queen when she visited Australia, quite different to when King Charles III visited Australia the other day. I don't think that even 7% of people would have seen him. But
well, she was here a lot longer in 1954.
Yes, true, 55 days I think it was. It was incredible. In Garran's view, he says it was a spectacular climax to the development of dominion status, that sort of idea that the Queen is not the Queen of England and Empire. She's actually the Queen of Australia, and she reigns here because she takes the advice of Australia's Prime Minister and ministers, not Britain's, and that sense that Australia has even more independence and status, of course, part of the broader, at that stage, of course, Commonwealth. But how do you see, once again, that evolution of Garran's thinking around Australian identity and, of course, its legal status as well?
Yes, well, I think that reference to a spectacular climax to dominion status is, in part, it's a reference to the Constitution of Australia, which refers to the Parliament of the Commonwealth consisting of the Queen, the Senate and the House of Representatives. And 1954 was the first occasion when the sovereign participated in that parliamentary process in person. And for people like Garran, who had, grown up through all the changes which had happened, that was a remarkably exciting event, the excitement of which could never be repeated again, really, in the same way. I think it is related to what I said earlier about the wish for Australia and Australians to be treated with respect.
Mm.
Now, by this time, Australia's independence is fully recognised, and, the British Empire is waning and the colonies are gradually becoming independent. So, it's clear how the whole debate about imperial relations has been resolved and is being resolved. But I think, therefore, they feel a certain sense of national pride, people like Garran, in the outcome of that process, I guess.
And it seems to me that it was not done in any dramatic sense, that this was sort of an incremental changing of the position and evolution of Australian identity through these years. That doesn't seem to me that Garran was some great radical, but he recognised the times and how Australia as an independent nation was going to be able to exert its independence, and it would do that through, pushing back when it needed to, asking for representation when it needed to, in the Statute of Westminster, of course. Mm-hmm. All these things incrementally gave Australia more and more independence. And, you see that even through the 60s with Britain's move to join the European Economic Community, Australia again distancing further and further away from Britain because it was an inevitability rather than something that was done with, a ripcord.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's very evolutionary.
Yeah.
And people respond to developments. I think part of the character of Australian political culture, actually, to approach issues in a more evolutionary kind of way. And in a way, our legal system probably encourages that sort of approach as well, I think. But yeah, I think you've analysed that quite accurately.
We're sitting here at the ANU in Canberra, and I think it's important to perhaps finish our discussion with some acknowledgement of Garran's role in the formation of Canberra itself, but also, of course, in the formation of this great university.
Yes, well, he had a very positive view of Canberra, and I think this reflected the idealism of the Federation generation. Canberra was a symbol of national unity, of the achievement of federation. The department he led, the Attorney General's Department, was one of the first departments to come up to Canberra and be centralised in Canberra in 1927, and he and his wife come here and establish a home. He's and his wife are both very conscious that this is a relatively new, essentially a new community with a lot of public servants, some of whom are very unhappy about leaving Melbourne.
Can imagine.
And they do their best to try and establish a community life beyond work. They engage in a lot of private hospitality, and there are lots of, stories about the way they reached out to people. Garran himself gets involved in establishing community organisations here, and they range from the establishment of the Canberra Rotary Club, which he's very involved in, the establishment of an Arts and Literature Society, which then there are various spin-offs from that society, but event is designed to try and establish a cultural life in Canberra. He establishes the first Canberra branch of the Australian Institute of International Affairs in the 1930s, and he's very involved with that. So in various areas, he tries to help develop a community life. Others are involved too, but he does take a leadership role. As far as university education in Canberra is concerned, he was very concerned that public servants should have an opportunity to develop their expertise. And he's part of the gradual movement towards employing more university graduates in the public service. There was some criticism at the time that this was elitist, but I think for Garran it was really a question of raising professional standards in the public service. His department had been strongly professional in that regard because most of the officers were qualified lawyers. He heads up the Canberra University College Council from the inception. This is a college of the University of Melbourne that's established to be a teaching university college in Canberra, from its establishment right through till, I think, 1953, which is not long before his death. He's well into his 80s. But then he also advocates for what he calls a national university in Canberra, in fact. And he sees that as a research university involved in the various subjects which are covered in the establishment of the research schools when the university is established. Now, of course, that's separate from the Canberra University College, but the two eventually, in fact, amalgamate. And Garran is on the first interim council of the university from 1946, and he's actually the first person on the roll of ANU's graduates because he's given an honorary doctorate of laws in 1951 at the first graduation ceremony.
It's lovely, isn't it?
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that he did see a National University of Australia in Canberra, what would become the ANU, as having particular research interests around Oriental matters, which of course means Asia, Pacific relations, international relations, public administration and economics. That this was the university that the government, would perhaps train would-be government bureaucrats in the issues and knowledge of the affairs of state, that, our place in the world, how we'd run our economy, these sorts of endeavours should and would be taught well here
and
at the ANU.
There would be repositories of expertise too at the university on which the Commonwealth government could draw, which he saw as a valuable contribution to further development of the Australian Commonwealth.
And I'd say he'd be happy with where it's ended up, I'm sure.
Well, I think he'd be pleased that, the ANU is highly regarded, generally speaking, and including internationally. I think that would be a source of real satisfaction to him, yes.
So he has a suburb named after him and a beautiful portrait in the National Portrait Gallery as well. But your efforts, of course, are putting him more on the nation's map. And, of course, we hope there's a great book at the end of this.
We'll see what the examiners of my thesis have to say.
Well, indeed. But, Colin, thank you so much for bringing to life once again Garran for us, a really key figure in our federation right through to the 1950s and development of Canberra. So really appreciate your time on Afternoon Light.
Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.